This is a community listening session for the El Granada Wildfire Resiliency Scoping Project. And by community listening session, that means we're here to listen to you. We're in a critical phase of this project to try to make sure that we have the best possible information to develop the best possible solutions. And so this is to hear a little bit from you. So a little bit about tonight's agenda. Can you see, by the way, can you see the sidebar that shows all your faces? I can see that on my screen. You can't, right?
Yeah, we got that.
Yeah, so I'll minimize that. Is that better?
Can't see it. You don't have to do anything.
But you couldn't see it, or you could. Well, that's all right. I'll minimize it and go on. So a little bit about tonight's agenda. We're going to introduce what the RCD is for those of you who are not terribly familiar with it. You'll see that I have times allocated to each of these. That's because we want to make sure that we really get to everything that we want to this evening. And in the top right corner, often you'll see the time that that's my aspiration for what time I hope we reach that slide by. So we're going to introduce the RCD. We're going to review the purpose and goals of this project, introduce the project team, review the scope of work and the timeline, like what's the work that's actually to be done, and then really dive into a listening session. And we have some guided questions and some open-ended questions to see if you have any data or information to share, and then some Q&A that might come up for you. And then we're going to wrap up. And I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until we get to the Q&A, just in case it's going to be answered anyway during the presentation parts. So what is the RCD? The Resource Conservation Districts, for those who aren't familiar, we are a local hub for conservation in San Mateo County. We've been around for well over 80 years now, with the fundamental purpose to help people help the land. Oh, now I'm getting admit. We have been what we call boots on the ground since 1939, and we work in very diverse ways. But the fundamental sort of connective tissue, the themes about the RCD are that we are non-regulatory. We always work where we're invited, doing voluntary work. We always work in partnership, and we use very diverse tools, whether it's project implementation, project design, technical assistance, outreach, education, sometimes engaging with policy, but not as an advocacy group. We find very diverse ways to help people help the land. And we are responsive. We're a form of local government that is very responsive to the priorities of our community, which is part of the reason why we have boards of directors that are typically residents within the community who can give us direction. Our focal areas based on these local priorities and community priorities have to do with water resources and water quality, mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change, contributing to biodiversity, enhancing habitat for wildlife, providing support to protect the viability of agriculture and help agriculture be an environmental solution. And which we're going to focus on tonight, we have a focus area on forest health and fire resiliency, speaking of wildfire resiliency. So these are just quickly, just to give you a sense of the RCD, these are some examples of the kinds of things that we've done, whether it's addressing catastrophic erosion, flooding in Pescadero and associated mortalities of protected species of fish is something that we help to solve. We have for a number of years done projects to reduce the risk of fire to communities that live in the wildland urban interface. And that brings us to this project, the El Granada Wildfire Resiliency Scoping Project. The purpose of this project is to develop a site-specific, meaning El Granada, understanding of wildfire scenarios for El Granada and the surrounding community, and to scope a suite of actions that would most effectively reduce those risks. So this isn't, the product will be essentially like a menu of different things that people can do that will, that are deemed most effective to reduce the risk of wildfire. The project goals for under that purpose are to define the wildfire risks, including fire ecology, fire history, the fire environment, fuels characteristics, fuel models, weather, topography, to assess the risks, including most likely scenarios, ignition probability, fire behavior, potential fire spread, general identification of values at risk, and to identify and scope an array of potential actions that would most effectively reduce those risks and build wildfire resiliency. I like to be really clear. I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but I just want to be able to share this with the community. This recording will be available, I believe, on the Midcoast Community Council website and on the RCD's YouTube page. But also you may choose to take a screenshot or pull out your camera to take a picture of any of these slides at any time. What this project will and will not do. So the project will develop recommendations for voluntary actions that different parties could take. It's not going to obligate any entity or any individual to taking any particular action. It is going to focus our resources on strategies to reduce risk moving forward. We are not involved with, it's beyond our scope to litigate the past, place blame, or take any sides. We're very forward focused. This will develop a site-specific understanding of higher probability and higher risk wildfires. We will not be able to predict all possible scenarios of fire or eliminate all risk of fire, such as extreme fires or extreme conditions or random events. We will develop recommendations to a conceptual level. These actions will be, described to a conceptual level, but it's not that every single recommendation will have designs or permits. It's not going to be down to the scale of recommendations for an individual home or that sort of thing. The recommendations might include things like fuel load reduction or other vegetation management, projects that improve firefighting access, or general home hardening recommendations. Maybe it could include things like policy changes like we've seen recently with the county, allowing an exemption to the tree ordinance. They will likely or probably involve both public and private lands. The recommendations will not include how to fight or respond to a fire, how the county or CAL FIRE should allocate their resources, and it's not addressing evacuation or egress. Those are all handled by other entities that have particular expertise and responsibilities in those areas. The project should support and leverage the work of experts at Coastside Fire Protection District, County Fire, and CAL FIRE, and will not replace or diminish their work or compete for resources. The idea here is that we should, rising tides raise all ships. We want to be able to support those who have unique responsibilities in protecting the community. And then for this meeting, our purpose, our goals are to listen. We have a lot of needs for information. We want to make sure we are using the best possible available information, and there's a lot of knowledge in the community, and we're hoping to get that knowledge from you tonight. Some of you have already met with the RCD and provided extensive information, particularly the residents along El Granada Boulevard put together a lot of information for us, which we very much appreciate and have forwarded to the consultants. And many others have shared things that they've researched or that they know about or what have you, and it's already being incorporated into the project. A little bit about our project team, and we're ahead of schedule, which is what I hoped for. This is great. The RCD is managing this project. It's RCD staff. The project manager is Sheena Sidhu, whom many of you have met. And thank you for those of you who have told me how great she is. I agree. And the consultants that were chosen through a competitive bid process, a solicitation process, and many of you were familiar with or weighed in on that. And that is Panorama Environmental and their subcontractors, Vibrant Planet and Prometheus Fire. And then we also have a partner team, and this is a group of advisors that we have assembled to help us identify resources, get information, generally be advisors to us. And I want to be clear that these aren't people who have votes on like particular outcomes, or they're not directing the project. They're resources to us. That includes staff from Supervisor Horsley's office, county parks, Coastside Fire Protection District, County Fire, CAL FIRE, Mid-Coast Community Council, an RCD Associate Director who was a resident of El Granada for 17 years, and a community at large member who is a resident of El Granada who played a leadership role in organizing the community to take advantage of that new exemption and remove a number of eucalyptus trees. So I just want to express my gratitude for all of these folks who have stepped up and agreed to be our advisors and bring your expertise and your time. Really very much appreciate that. So Sheena, why don't I turn this over to you to kind of talk through the scope of work and timeline?
Yes, thank you. And we're doing great on time. So I wanted to share the timeline. Some folks have seen this at the MCC meeting that I presented previously, and it's also on our website, on the RCD's website page that shares the information about this project. So right now we are in the data collection phase. This is taking the full month of January. We have met with residents, agencies, all the partners, and collected data. Here we're looking for data and information that's going to be put into the model and also inform the planning of the projects and the actions that are going to be the outcome of the scoping. So what does this data look like? It's both quantitative and qualitative, and we're receiving different pieces of information, and the consultants are receiving that and reviewing and synthesizing that. And then the next step will be assessing risk. So this is where the data is going to be actually used, and this is where the modeling happens. So the data is going to be used to look at the risk of fire hazards and fire risk. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to be using the collected data, which I'll be talking about in just a moment, and inputting it into what is called an IFTDIS, which is an TDSS. It's a model that's used by a lot of different agencies to model fire risk. And so it's used by the U.S. Forest Service, National Parks, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, among many other agencies. So it's like this known reputable model to assess risk. And so what goes into the model? What is this data that we're collecting to put into the model? It's information, detailed information about vegetation types, ladder fuels, and how it looks like on the topography, canopy cover. We're going to be including topography, weather, different aspects of weather, and including wind patterns. I know that's a strong concern for folks. And also we're going to be integrating assets and assets at risk into the model. And so when you put this into the model, as we're assessing risk, there's going to be outputs of that. So what are the outputs? The outputs are going to be looking at flame length, burn probability, and overall generating a map of where there's the highest risks and the integrated risks of where there's high fire intensity and high fire probability. So once this is done, this is going to take the month of February, maybe a little bit into March, but that's going to be used to then go to the next step, which is developing recommendations. This is where we're going to develop the suite of actions. So that includes not only vegetation management projects, but also different actions such as policy or different recommendations for individual, what can be done potentially at an individual homeowner level. And then we're going to put that all together into a final report around April, and then we're going to be presenting it to the community in May. And through this, all the partners will be meeting regularly with the consultants to review the progress, and I'll be continuing to share it out. I'll be continuing to attend MCC meetings and providing updates for folks. Alex, could you go to the next slide?
I want to just quickly just say, before we go to the next slide, that I see that somebody put a comment in the chat, and just so you know, we will not be checking the chat. We will, during Q&A, we'll be able to address questions. Go for it, Sheena.
And then I just wanted to put this image up too. This is also another image that I've shared before, but to just explain what we're looking at when we're talking about the scope and where it is exactly what we're doing this work. So the yellow outline is the community of El Granada, so how we're identifying El Granada. And then we're going 3 miles out into the periphery of the bluish green circle of where we're focusing on our data collection. Again, this is that quantitative and qualitative data. And we picked the 3 miles because that seems representative and makes sense, that where we can really dig into the fine level analysis that's particularly for the community of El Granada. So this is the area that we're looking at and where the projects and the actions will be developed for. Alex.
So yeah, so now we want to shift to hearing from you. We're going to really shift into our listening session now. Oh, by the way, I should apologize in advance. If in this presentation you see a photo of your home, I took these images from Redfin. And so if your home was recently purchased and there's a photo on here, sorry to creep you out. I was not stalking you. So we are going to ask you a series of questions to help you be able to provide input. We're going to share with you the list of the types of data that go into this model or are qualitative, and ask if there's anything missing or that you would add. And then we're going to add a list of assets, the type of assets that are being considered, and see if there's anything that you would add. Whether there are weather or wind stations in the community that we have not identified, maybe some of you have something like that and can offer it. Whether there are any collective or other significant efforts to reduce wildfire risk that we have not identified, and any other, let me move this is in the way for me, any other community observations that would be an asset to the project. So we're gonna slip now into this listening session, first being the getting input from you on the data, the types of data. The types of data that we currently have. We have lists of projects that have been done. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. We have vegetation maps that are fine scale using county LiDAR data that talk about vegetation type, canopy height, enclosure, ladder fuels, etc. We also, from that LiDAR data set, we have fine scale data that show contours and topography. We have data from the county on land ownership. We have data on wind patterns, weather history, moisture, fire interval, fire history. We have maps of roads paved and unpaved that give some indication of where there might be access for different treatments. Treatments meaning like vegetation management or that sort of thing. We have data about where there are evacuation routes. And we also have some documents that have been provided by partners like CAL FIRE and others, and also from community members. Again, a shout out to some folks who put a lot of effort into submitting a number of their documents. So the first thing we want to do is spend a couple of minutes talking with you just about this, whether this is an exhaustive list or whether anybody has data that we didn't know about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this share and ask you if anybody here has data or can think of a type of data that wasn't included on that list that you think that would be helpful. Would you kindly raise your hand? The way to do that, if you're not familiar, is in the I'm trying to, how do I explain how to do this when I'm not in it?
Yeah, if you go down to the reactions button, then you can choose to raise your hand, and that's a little different than the hand waving one. So raising your hand moves you up to the top, and it's easier for us to see you.
So you saw that the list of data. Oh, Susan, yes.
Thank you. Thanks for having this. So, when I see fire weather and fire weather history data and so forth, one of the things that comes to mind is last Friday, and that's very, very recent history. And maybe there's some, is there other things that we need to be thinking about, I don't know, extrapolating the weather changing at a rate that seems to be greater than what history would indicate. With the Colorado fire down in Big Sur, that was a kind of a surprise in January, although the winds were so strong from the east and northeast that it is, again, surprising for that to be happening in January, where it's normally in the fall of the year. So just kind of thinking about what other things may happen based upon history, very recent history.
Panorama or Vibrant Planet folks, did you have any follow-up questions for that? I just want to make sure that you have the opportunity if you needed it. No? Okay.
I think I would just ask, what was it specifically about last Friday that you want us to be aware of so that we know to go back and look for that specific data?
Oh, okay. Yes, it was a pretty significant windstorm. I was tracking humidity and wind throughout the day on Friday, the 21st, and humidity in the morning started out at 70%, and by 10 p.m. it was down to 28%, and the winds were gusting, and things really dried out. And so it almost felt, other than it wasn't 80 degrees outside, it almost felt like a Diablo wind offshore wind day in the fall, where fire danger is quite high. And so that is what I'm referring to. And then by, like, I don't know, was it 10:15 or by 11 o'clock at night, we lost power along at least a good portion of El Granada. According to PG&E, it was, I think, 374 residents. And so that was what all day Saturday was like for us. And the wind gusts would suggest that they were quite high. Just in the valley behind us off of the Avenue Portola fire road, 2 trees went down. One was eucalyptus and one was an old pine. But just 20-mile-per-hour gusts wouldn't necessarily do that. And then of course, Quarry Park. But then there was since we have had recent rain, the grounds were softer too. So that might have contributed to more trees going down. But these are just some thoughts of what happened very recently that is concerning and different from the past.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to then move to, so Susan, if you don't mind taking your hand down, I'm going to call on Steve. And Steve, it sounds like you have an idea for additional data.
Yeah, yeah. My name is Steve Horn. I'm on from Avenue Balboa. It seems to me that you should also track very carefully all of the power lines, the feeders coming through, because that's where quite a lot of fires start. I'm sure PG&E actually has an incident map associated with that. In that storm, we actually had a tree come down across the power line. There was a massive sparks, a big explosion, a loud bang. If those sparks had managed to get themselves into the canopy of the eucalypts at that point in time, it could have been a problem.
Panorama, did you have any follow-up questions for that? Oh, can you hear me? I said, did you have any follow-up questions for that? No?
I don't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Jill.
Hi, my name is Jill Grant, and I'm one of the members of the Mid-Coast Community Council, but I'm speaking as a private individual tonight. I'm following up on both speakers. I like the idea of the PG&E data. These microbursts of energy, such as what we had on January 23rd, had wind gusts up to 90 miles per hour. You can look on NOAA and find that graph. And I'm located right next to the median at Balboa and Avenue Alhambra, and those trees blew down and smashed a car, and the power went out, and it was out for almost 24 hours. And we walked the fire trail the next day in Quarry Park, and there were more than 9 trees also blown down. So those microbursts, I don't know how you can track them, but maybe that PG&E data would be a helpful way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jane?
Hi. I want to talk a little bit about the wind data as well. As you know, I turned in a report to you today, and one of the problems I was having is finding the data on the largest fires and the speeds of the wind. And as an example, Big Sur was 50 miles per hour. Sonoma County's fire in 2019 was 25 to 40, and then the Paradise Fire was 25 to 35. So I think getting for your data, I wasn't able to find it, but getting the wind speeds and how they affected each of those fires, both the speed and the size of the fires would be really interesting. And something someone was researching today, and they told me, and I don't know if I have the exact number, but she read that the eucalyptus in the medians can slow the speeds down by 15 miles per hour. So if that's true, it'd be very interesting to put that into your model, if it's true, and see what the effects of taking down the windbreaks would actually have on wind speed and the drying down of the vegetation. So I think, you know, when I did my research, it was dryness of the vegetation, which the winds dries out. It was aridity and it was drought. But the number one overriding element of all these really big wildfires was the speed of the wind. So I think that's just really critical data. Thank you.
Thank you. Katie? Katie Wood?
Katie?
Hi, sorry. I'm pretty much piggybacking on what a lot has been said. I also walked in Quarry Park, and there's an enormous amount of debris everywhere, along with trees down. So if we are looking at, you know, the information in previous circumstances, you know, what's happened in this last weekend, quite frankly, if there was high heat and drought, I think this conversation would be going into, we just had a fire. And as far as looking at the previous history, I've now lived here on El Granada Boulevard for 5 years, and consistently, actually probably even in pictures, show just how it is different year over year. And every year, the fire chances have increased to the extent, you know, that many are losing their house insurance because of the high fire risk that we've now been deemed. So fortunate or unfortunate, I'm not quite sure which direction to use that word, for those that are looking at the scope, I really do believe, just to reiterate what's already been said, is that we should, and you're way more, you way more understand this than I, but I think this last weekend should definitely be taken into consideration. And then with looking at the different scenarios, realize that one, and again, there's more people on this call than I that do have facts and figures, but I've never seen this happen in January. And it's just continuously, it used to feel like, okay, well, you know, August, September, we have a fire risk. We now have a fire risk 365 days of the year.
So Katie, I'm gonna jump in just for time management
Oh
purposes.
no, I
and
was
see
gonna, that was it.
Okay, I just want to see if I've got this right. So it sounds like you're reiterating that you think an important source of data is changes in wind patterns, and maybe changes in vegetation.
And also in, just the type of heat that we've been having at the different times of the year.
Got it. Thank you. Is this REA?
This is REA. Thank you. And thanks for doing this. I am a volunteer with El Granada Cert. I've been living in El Granada for 40 years. I'm not 100% sure whether you'll consider this data, but it has to do with evacuation. I noticed one of your categories was evacuation routes. CERT, the Citizens Emergency Response Team, which is under the direction of Fire Chief David Cosgrave, we have designated a couple of emergency evacuation sites in El Granada that not everybody may be aware of in the event of a wildfire, where we're going to set up a tent with supplies, with ham radio operators, where we can get in fire crews or ambulances and so on. One is at El Granada School, elementary school, and the other one is at the other end of town where the old Monster Chef restaurant was. So I think that that's something that everyone needs to be aware of, that these sites are where we're going to have tents, we're going to have volunteers, we'll have first aid supplies, we'll have radio, and we can get information to people who may want to walk there during an emergency.
Thank you. Did I don't know if the Panorama folks, did you have any follow-up questions for that?
I don't have follow-up questions. I just want to say that is good data, and that is something that is important for us to know. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Karen.
Hi, I just want to thank you and RCD and all your partners for undertaking this project. It's much appreciated. I'll be short. I'm a 21-year resident of El Granada and a CERT volunteer as well. Regarding the storm on Friday, I agree it's a little unusual to have basically fire weather in January. What I will say is I have a weather station at my home, and before the power went out, I clocked winds of 45.5 miles an hour. And then they got higher, but the power was out, so I have no way to document that. The winds were straight from the northeast. It was dry. It was warmer than usual. We had a lot of trees down. We did have a power pole fire at the base of El Granada Boulevard that blocked the road, which is our evacuation route. And the only other evacuation route also had a tree down, blocking the street. So it's kind of a great illustration of kind of a perfect storm, so to speak, for fire season happening in January. So I just mentioned that as you're building out scenarios as part of your project, it's worth looking at this as a test case since it just happened. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, and also for having filled us in when we spoke with you before about the wind and weather station. I also want to, if I may, just riff off of something you said. You thanked us for doing this work, and I want to thank Len Erickson, a member of your community who really catalyzed this work. He's the person who reached out to us, and he had also reached out to the county and helped to pull together resources to initiate this work. And then Supervisor Horsley and Lena, who's on the line with us, his staff member, really supported this and made it possible. So just wanted to give credit where credit is due. And thanks for your input. So Gopi, on to you.
Mute.
Gopi.
So just a quick comment. Could we include property damage reports and insurance claims as data? Because we're not sure, exactly what, which areas are actually getting affected necessarily. So that would be useful, but also will help with the economic case for doing some actions.
Yeah, I'm going to pass that to Panorama in a moment, but before I do, it occurred to me when I put that slide on what this will and won't do, what I didn't say is that this is not going to do like a really like quantitative impact. Is not going to go into details, just so to manage folks' expectations about your property values or that sort of thing. And also I should have mentioned that the recommended actions are not going to be based on, for example, more valuable homes count more or anything like that. I should have mentioned that earlier. But then, Rita, maybe I'll pass this to you regarding a direct answer to his question.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure I have a direct answer just yet. I'm not exactly sure if how the property damage reports and insurance claims can be factored in, and that's not to say they can't. I think I just need to think about it a little bit more, and I guess I'd open it up to either Mike or Colton from Vibrant Planet to see if they've had experience working with those off the top of their head, knowing in the past if it's been done, but otherwise I'd like to look into it.
No, that's not something that we normally take into account per se. I think that the information really that we provide gets at that risk aspect and the assets that are at risk. Really, the data and information that we use and is most useful to us in our analysis is spatially explicit data. So the evacuation sites, that's great. That's a point on a map that we can actually use and we can incorporate into our analysis to ensure that any sort of recommendation is commensurate with that asset that it has been identified. I'll touch quickly on the weather. So we do model the 97th percentile weather. So that's basically the worst 3% of weather, or the most extreme 3% of weather that has been recorded at any particular weather station. I know there's been some conversations about which weather stations to use, and we have not identified which ones we're going to use yet. We're going to do a little bit of digging, make sure that we really are incorporating the best data for this community when we run our analysis. And we're happy to share which weather station or stations were used as part of our report. We also do incorporate transmission and distribution power lines into our analysis. We do have a data source that we use so that we can also incorporate that as well. As far as ignition starts go, Colton, do you want to speak briefly about how we utilize ignitions and potential ignition sources in our modeling and help to drive some of our conclusions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've been distracted looking at some of the weather stations in the area there as you guys talk about that importance of those. The ignitions so far are general process and what was described through the IFTDIS portal for fire modeling uses stochastic ignitions, which means it basically models random ignitions across the landscape until at least 98% of the burnable pixels in the landscape file have been burned. And so I know that, well, let me just break that down really quickly. So there's a fuel model layer as a part of the input to that process. And there's a whole suite of different fuel models. There's been some talk tonight about the importance of getting eucalyptus right. And there's a whole suite of other potential ones. And then there's also non-burnable pixels in there, things like water, roads, barren land, things like that. And so generally to have a good burn probability and analysis output, you want at least 98% of the burnable pixels to have experienced fire in your simulations. And for El Granada, just thinking, it kind of depends on the resolution of the landscape files, but I believe they're at 5 meters. And we'll probably need about 10,000 simulations or so to achieve that. And so that obviously, that alone doesn't take into consideration potential ignition where might be more prone to ignitions, but we could certainly consider that as kind of a secondary level in the analysis.
Thank you. I just put something in the chat box just so in case anybody's not checking that, saying that just to keep us moving, because there's a number of things we hope to talk about. We're going to stop the input on the list of data sources after Fran Pollard, who has her hand up right now, and then go on to the next topic. And just a reminder to folks that right now we're focusing on are there any types of data that you know of that we might not have that might be valuable for this? Other things that you might want to contribute or might want to ask about? I'm sure there's going to be opportunity for that coming up. So Richard, why don't we shift to you?
Sorry, can we put stuff in the chat? Is that okay? Or
no, I'd rather you not, so that we don't get pulled in different directions, if you don't mind. But we'll get to if it's not covered in one of the specific slides, then we have general Q&A at the end.
okay.
Thanks for asking that. Oh, where'd Richard go?
Hey, I'm here. I just lowered my hand. Okay. So sorry, I joined late. I had another class that was on Zoom, and I just couldn't. So I think this is off topic. So I'm going to be very brief, but I just wanted to say that, first of all, thanks. Secondly, we really need to do something about replacing, the trees on a proactive basis, because they're all dying. Quarry Park does scare me a lot. I live in El Granada. I've lived here for about 7 years, but we've been coming down here since '78. And the idea of mowing the medians is horrific. And I would hope that we can have a good forestry management system where we can replace these things over time. And again, I think it's off topic, so I'm going to shut up.
Well, thank you for offering that. And yes, it's a little off topic. So when you get a chance, we are recording this, and it's going to be on the RCD's YouTube page, and I believe MCC is going to put on their page too. So you will have a chance to hear the beginning of how we're framing what we're talking about tonight. It's not that we don't care about your input on that, but tonight we're just kind of focused on the data collection piece.
Thank you.
Thank you. Graham.
Okay, hi. Graham Wood. I'm a 20-year El Granada resident up on El Granada Boulevard. One of the other potential data sources, I think, is, PG&E has been mentioned a few times, but actually I don't know if it's possible to get the information from PG&E about power outages. There are a number of times that we've had the PSPS outages in El Granada. Some of them have been very, very localized, but allowing the project team to find out where PG&E think the biggest risk is. One of the things that happens with all the power outages is that it means that lots of people now have generators and have 5 gallons of gas in their garage, which then itself becomes a fire risk. And certainly this weekend, when we were out of power, there was a constant hum of generators along the road here. And so, yeah, there's lots of people with fuel in their garages, which can't be good for fire risk. And I know PG&E has this thing about putting lines underground. Whether one of the things that comes out of this project can be to lobby PG&E to do some of that in El Granada earlier rather than later, because that would reduce fire risk in many ways.
Thank you, Graham. Walter, did you have any additional input on the data?
Not on the data itself. I just had a question, and I had a question on the estimates. Is that okay if I pose a question?
Estimates. Why don't you save your question to the Q&A at the end,
Okay,
and we'll see
no
if we
problem.
get to it before then. Thank you. Liz, and I don't know if everybody heard, we're stopping input on this topic after Fran. So anybody who's after that, hopefully there will be an opportunity for you in the subsequent slides or the Q&A at the end. So Liz Waters.
Hi, my intent was to discuss myths and unintended consequences. So as far as the data collection is concerned, I think it is absolutely critical that pollinator habitat be considered with widespread bee colony collapses. Eucalyptus are particularly valuable as bee pasture because they supply food year round. One single tree has tens of thousands of blossoms that provide food year round for pollinators. And the loss of habitat for raptors and owls is also of critical importance because without them, rat and rodent populations could literally explode, and that could force and probably would force a lot of people to use pesticides, which in turn will kill pets and wildlife up to and including you know, apex predators. You know, we have been watching a nest of red-shouldered hawks.
I'm very sorry. I have the most unenviable position of having to manage time and the flow of the meeting. And so I just want to speak to that. So that information that you're offering, I think will come in more with project design. Okay. So later on, so further on in the process, if you're looking at vegetation management, let's say, for example, presumably eucalyptus removal is one of the things that's recommended. As you design a project or permit a project, you have to really think through all of the environmental impacts of that work. And that's when those considerations would come in. And I personally would be very happy to talk with you about that at any time when we get to that phase.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to speak with you and also Sheena, who I remember from ELCUS. So I will be getting all of my scientific data.
Yeah, Sheena's a PhD. She's a PhD entomologist, and if you want to talk about bugs, it's near and dear to her heart. So you've got a captive audience with her.
Anytime, Liz.
Okay, thank you.
And Fran, you are the last person on this particular topic. Did you have any input on the data?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, before we start replanting trees, I think we need to get rid of the eucalyptus. I'm more worried about this town burning up, as we've seen other communities, rather than worrying about replanting right away. Let's have see if we have 2 years without drought.
Frank, did you have input on the data, the list of data itself?
Well, I would like you to maybe, I don't know if you can, but encourage PG&E to underground their lines, because all the trees are hanging over their lines and going to cause fire. I'd like you to encourage the neighbors, the residents, to cut their trees, especially this year while the county is waiving the fees.
Fran, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna have to cut you off. Right now, what we're doing is we're getting input from the community on sources of data to be able to model the fire risk and behavior. I appreciate that you have recommendations for solutions, and I look forward to hearing more about that. But right now, do you have anything to offer regarding input on the data?
Well, I thought that was part of it, that there's too many trees around homes that need to be cut too.
Okay, well, we'll note that that's your recommendation then. And so then I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. And I'm sorry again that I have to be the evil timekeeper on this, but I definitely want to make sure that we are able to get all of the information from the community that's possible. So I'm going to go to the next, I'm going to share my screen again and go to the next slide here. So we just talked about getting some input. Thank you, all of you, for your recommendations and your input on the data. And then now we want to talk about, get input from you on the list of assets that are being considered. And just to clarify, by assets, that is something that is above ground. So thank you to a member of the community who asked about, for example, sewage infrastructure. That would not be considered an above ground maybe, but below ground sewage infrastructure would not be considered an asset for this purpose. So what's on this current list is structures greater than 500 square feet, roads, cell towers, radio antenna, emergency service stations, substations, power plants, transmission and distribution lines, water and waste treatment facilities, stream gauges, reservoirs and dams, expected buildings affected, evacuation routes. We wanted to ask you, are there any other assets that we should be thinking about that aren't on this list? Let me give you a chance to take a look at this again, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if, just ask for input. So, looks like we do. Fran, did you have input on the asset list, or is your hand still up from before?
Oh, it's still up.
Okay.
I'll take it down. Oops.
That's okay.
Oh, no.
And yes, Ms. Fleming, did you have
Yes.
input on that?
I have two suggestions for additional assets. We have to look at PG&E about 6 months ago allocated was something like 30 to 50 billion dollars for clearing trees. And I think it's so critical and urgent that some influence at the county level get weighed against PG&E to get some help in this community with getting those power lines underground. And then on a more simpler note, I use a 1950s transistor radio when the power went out for 24 hours on Friday. And so be aware you can get some of these radios down at Half Moon Bay Electronics, but it's great when you don't have power and you don't have internet. And that is all.
Thank you. Danny?
Thank you. This might be peripheral to the fire modeling, but it is in the evacuation aspect of modeling, if that's going to be a part of it. The two evac routes we have are Capistrano and what is not Alhambra, the other one is Coronado Street. We should be using the current Caltrans intervals for timing of red lights. We should call upon Caltrans as well to see if there's any chance they can have an urgent evacuation program for those lights. Because when we could turn them on to a few minutes worth of side traffic entering Highway 1 as a default in a panic situation, it would change the modeling of that evacuation for the community dramatically, I think. That's it.
Thank you, Danny. And Jane?
Sorry, I have a time unmuting. So I have 3 suggestions. One of them is to look at the hospital as a potential asset in case we have an evacuation or problem. I know it's not a hospital that's used very often, but that's important. The other aspect I wanted to mention is the idea of parts of nature being assets. We're near the ocean, and the pier is a great evacuation site. And the third item that I want to mention, which will be a little controversial, but I will set it in the idea of what modeling you're doing. I think if the windbreaks, the tree windbreaks, are indeed the first line of defense against wind, we might consider those as an asset. And that, of course, will be determined by your modeling. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think also that I also wasn't clear entirely that we also were referring to assets at risk in a fire. I see that, of course, an asset, the hospital would be an asset for evacuation. And if anybody also has input on assets at risk that weren't included in that list as well. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, I think you mentioned transmission lines and things like that, but there's probably some dedicated internet infrastructure, which we all rely on these days, which was not on the list. I think we should consider that. You know, for example, down at the end of El Granada, there's the local ISP. So.
Great, so then that was the last hand up. So I'm gonna share my screen again and go to the next slide. Hold on one second. So one of the things that came out of a conversation that we had with some of you was about where there might be additional weather and wind stations. So these are the ones that are currently on our radar, so to speak. Between NOAA's National Weather Service ones for the area, windy.com, PG&E emergency shutdown weather maps. These are some of which we're aware. We also, with some recommendations from the community, are going to be contacting SFPUC to see if they might have any information that's up on the ridge, the land that's owned by SFPUC behind you. We know now of one member of the community who has a weather station, and I'm going to stop my share and ask, do you know of any other weather or wind stations? Do any of you have them? Come on, you ham radio operators out there. You've also got wind stations and weather stations. And Steve.
How about the harbor? I think there's a weather station down there. I'm not sure.
Harbor? Okay, thank you. We'll check into that. Graham, did you know of one as well?
I have a weather station on the house. Unfortunately, it's not on the roof, which means that it's not 100% in all directions, but I have one and happy to provide data.
Any other members of Wonderground, Weather Underground? Oh, okay, Keith?
Yeah, someone at some point had suggested that we contact whoever it is that has the facility at the top of Scarper Peak. And I don't know who that is, but presumably you could find out fairly easily.
We'll try and ferret that out. I don't know what Scarper Peak is. I'm sure I should. What is it?
That's it's some kind of a transmission facility. In theory, it's the Federal Aviation Agency that's right up, 2 miles up the hill on El Granada Boulevard, off to the right.
Michelle, I saw you on screen briefly, but then you disappeared. Did you have one?
Oh yeah. Well, you mentioned Weather Underground, which I just was going to suggest. I see on the map that there are 4 weather stations in El Granada marked on Weather Underground. So at least 4 people in the community have their own personal weather stations.
Thank you. I love Wonderground. Great, thanks. And Karen, your hand was up and then it went down. Did you have something you were going to say?
Yes, sorry, I was responding to the Scarper Ridge comment. Scarper Ridge is, if you go past the lock gate at the top of El Granada Boulevard and you follow that road up through Post Land, you get to a ridge beyond which you can see San Francisco Bay, et cetera, et cetera. That's the PUC land, but that ridge is that peak is just above the old gun club. And there's a radar array up there, and I believe the FAA manages it.
I know exactly where that is. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the other, the harbor wind location is operated by SailFlow. It's a paid app that it's a very, very accurate, good app for looking at the wind in that location.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Hi, yeah, you all may be aware of this already, but I just want to mention Zone Haven, which provides good current data on weather conditions.
Thank you. I actually think Zone Haven uses some of the same sources that were on our list as well. So thank you for that. Okay, so then, Walter.
Hi, quick question. Is there a need for more weather stations?
A question for Panorama et al.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Mike, let me jump in real quick, and then if you want a 2-second answer after that. I think what we need right now is data that has been already compiled. We're looking for historical weather data. So moving forward, it might be good to have for a future project, but it's not something that if you start collecting data now that we'll be able to use.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I'll,
Go ahead.
yep. Nope, I'm good.
Okay, I didn't mean to shut you down there, Mike. Okay, then I am going to share my screen again for the next topic on which we hope to get your input. I have to say, so far, I personally am finding this very helpful and useful and really appreciative of the capacities and expertise and resources in the community. So thank you for partnering with us to bring solutions. Let me share my screen again. Okay. So is it showing? I have too many windows open. Is it showing the slide that's collective efforts?
Yeah, that
Yes?
looks good.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the other things that we're considering in this work is historic, current, and planned efforts to reduce wildfire risk. We are pretty familiar with efforts by Post, county parks, Coastside Fire Protection District, the community members on El Granada Boulevard, the RCD and Fire Safe Council partnership on the chipping program. But we're interested in knowing if there are any other significant efforts or collaborative efforts underway with which we're not familiar. And before anybody answers that question, I want to be really clear that this is not the space where we're going to be commenting on anyone else's efforts or discussing the history of anyone else's efforts. So those folks on that list, we're familiar with their efforts, regardless of whether or not you liked any of their efforts. But if there are any additional efforts going on, other work that is not on that list, would you kindly let us know? Anything planned, historic, current? Anybody doing anything? Yes, Danny.
Just a general question as someone who has personally cut down trees recently. Would the RCD, in theory, I think this is completely not in keeping with the way things are done, but would the RCD, in theory, support community clearing of public lands if it could be established that there'd be no liability and it was basically, as a publicly owned land, up to the people to do it if we didn't have resources otherwise?
You know, that's actually not what we do. We don't take positions on what people should do on somebody else's property. What we do is we typically help landowners and land managers. If there was a relationship between the community and a landowner, we could support that. We might even help facilitate that if it was appropriate. But I don't even know that that would necessarily be needed, but there have been times that we have coordinated, for example, what we've called weed warriors, where we've coordinated people to come out and pull weeds on somebody else's property, that sort of thing. I think that if it was, I'm just shooting from the hip here, Danny, just to be clear, that if it was something that's like a larger scale tree removal process with significant permitting requirements or liability related issues, I personally prefer to see that handled by professionals than, you know, community members with chainsaws. So I guess it depends on the scope of what you're saying, but we're typically not in the business.
That was the exact question. Moving on, thank you.
Okay, okay. Yes, Keith.
Three possible participants in this whole thing would be SFPUC, obviously, because there's probably a pretty good chance a fire might originate up there. GGNRA, of course, it's a lot closer, same land characteristics, and possibly state parks, although I don't really know too much of what state parks has done in that arena. But I know for sure SFPUC has been very active, and I believe that GGNRA should be.
You know, now that you mentioned those, Keith, it also occurs to me that we should probably contact Caltrans about anything they might be doing in their right of way.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other known or known historic, current, or planned efforts, or like Keith suggested, others that we might want to reach out to ask? Yes, Melinda.
I'm just wondering if this would include organizations that do ecological restoration as well as part of fire resiliency instead of just cutting trees down?
Well, we don't know that wildfire resiliency is necessarily cutting trees down in all cases. There's home hardening, there's policy changes, there's vegetation management, there's evacuation routes, firefighting access, vegetation management that's about healthy forests or ecosystems. I mean, there's a huge variety of things that can constitute wildfire resilience.
So I think, wouldn't you guys then, RCD, be on the list for vegetation management at least? Are you already putting yourselves on that list?
Yes, for example, we run the CHIPPR program, and we do a great deal of habitat restoration. Right now, we're throughout the county, we're working on, what is it, Sheena, like 900 acres of forest health projects that also reduce wildfire risk?
1,500, yeah.
There you go. So,
okay,
yeah.
so I missed your name on the list, so I was just suggesting you guys put yourselves on the list.
Oh, well, we are right now, the work that we're doing is this project, and also the CHIPPR program, which is one of it is an identified project. So, but hopefully, some of the recommendations that come out of this report are things that we can support or help accomplish.
Okay, thanks.
And yes, with an ecological perspective, incidentally, since you and I have talked a lot about that, that's a core value of the RCD.
Thank you. Great.
Steve.
Not sure whether this is exactly in the wheelhouse of this question, but there's local insurance companies are applying pressure to reduce burnable material. I know down in Pescadero they've been through, and in fact in my house I had to do a bunch of work, and so they are a force to be reckoned with, and quite often a force for good. And so they are actually they probably do belong on this list if you're going to engage people that are causing these things to happen.
So, are you saying that the insurance companies are doing projects?
No, that's why I said it's probably not quite on the wheelhouse. They're causing small projects to happen, right, at the residential level.
Do you know of any significant efforts that are happening at the residential level caused by that? And incidentally, that issue of what's happening with insurance companies was a key driver for us at the RCD starting our forest health and fire resiliency program. It was when Keith Mangold reached out to us from the community and said, people are freaking out, they're losing their insurance. What can you do about this?
Yeah, look, one insurance, one person reasonably high up in one insurance company that I probably shouldn't name said that they are going to start applying more pressure to a lot of communities in the area that they consider to be fire risks and will effectively cause these projects to occur. They may actually even have money to help these things occur too.
Well, if you do know of any projects that are occurring, would you reach out to us?
Okay, I can do that. Yep.
Thank you. And, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking when you sort of asked for different groups. I know the Amamutsan Ohlone tribal band does work with prescribed burns and land management with regards to fire. So I just thought
they're not working in this area. El Granada's outside of their tribal lands. They're working with us actually in state parks in Croce Valley and Año Nuevo area and that sort of thing. But this is outside of their territory.
Okay, well, whoever's territory it's not outside, they might have a perspective. So just thought I'd name that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. We did not seek an Indigenous perspective, so maybe we'll do that. Thank you for that input. Walter?
Hi. My house insurance company, they offered a program to do things like clear vegetation and even spray foam. That's some sort of fire retardant foam on a house in case of a wildfire. And that was kind of like a pilot project. It did end last December. Are you interested in that, or is it just not of interest because it ended?
Let me ask that of the Panorama folks.
This might be something that falls into more of our informational, not necessarily spatial data. If there were beneficial outcomes that you felt you received from a program like that, I think it's information that we'd like to know about. It could be an action that we consider recommending, not necessarily, a spatial area for treatment, but some other kind of action. So I think send it over to Sheena, and she can send it our way and we can take a look.
Thank you. And I appreciate, Rita, you also making this distinction. Just so folks know, there are some things that are quantitative and go into the model, and there are other things that are qualitative or contextual that are, it's still important for us to know and understand for the best possible project. So thank you for that. Are there any other known historic, recent, underway, or planned efforts to address the risk of wildfire in El Granada at any scale or any type of project? Okay. Oh, yes. All right.
Let's see, the Coastside Fire Protection District has a phone number. If you want advice on, as a individual homeowner, on defensible space around your house, what should I do about that tree or that bush, or what about my roof? You can call that number and have a CAL FIRE employee come and advise you on defensible space.
Thank you for pointing out that resource. Yes, that's true. Great, thank you. So then I'm going to then share my screen again. And this is the last really focused question for input, guided question before we have some more general. Okay. Okay, so then we just want to know any other observations or data you may have. I think a lot of them came up during this conversation, but just in case we missed something. For example, if anybody really has good knowledge about when and where fireworks happen in Quarry Park or other places, or other observations. I think we've actually gotten some good observations tonight about wind and weather patterns and changing weather. Observations that you might have about where there are active geological features, landslides or slipping earth that might be a constraint or a design consideration with vegetation management. Observations about vegetation that you have or vegetative changes over time. Some of that's come up, or anything else, any other observations that you as local experts have regarding things that are risks to wildfire that that you want to make sure that we know. Yes. Mary?
Oh, excuse me. I didn't know you were identifying me. I just wanted to definitely, since I may be one of the oldest people in El Granada, close to 50 years, and I am right on El Granada Boulevard near quite a few of my neighbors here. And I just asked the consultants, have you gotten data very specific to what I understand was the conflagration that occurred in the 1940s directly on El Granada Boulevard, and that it was totally wiped out in that decade? That's my first question. And then just an observation about vegetation. I will just mention that when there is a clear cutting of trees and then the chopping, this happened behind my house. Poison oak takes over in very serious degrees. That's my only comment. Thank you.
A great native plant with habitat for pollinators. Not a fan, huh?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, I said poison oak is a great native plant with habitat for pollinators, but you're not a fan, huh?
I'm not a fan. I wind up over. I wind up over at Stanford. Is what happens.
Got it. Got it.
Okay.
Rita, did Panorama have any follow-up questions regarding her input
I'm not
there?
familiar with the first point, so go ahead and send over if the event that happened in the 1940s. I'm not familiar with that, so please send us the information.
And so I just want to emphasize that is why I am mentioning that. I truly remember someone mentioning that to me. I moved in the early 70s, and I don't know how easy it would be to find any kind of record on what took place. That's all.
Any other observations, important information? Is anybody really dialed on the fireworks in particular? I'm curious about that. Oh yes, Melinda.
Hi, thanks. Okay, so I just noticed there's a lot, and I'm not sure, maybe I just haven't been seeing it before. Maybe it's always been there, but the poison ivy climbing up the trees in Quarry Park just seems really a lot of it. And then the fireworks, I have heard, they always feel like they're coming from the hills if I hear them, and they're usually on a weekday night, which is really weird. That's it.
Thank you, Melinda. Jane?
Wanted to make some comments about fireworks. I guess it was about 2 years ago that there were a lot of young people that went to Quarry Park, and they I think they were having fires or fireworks or something. I don't remember the details, but the problem that was identified is we don't have the police force that can really control large crowds when they show up unexpectedly. And so I think there was some discussion about how can we address that, but I don't know if we ever really did. There are neighbors in my neighborhood that explode fireworks, and it's very disturbing when they do that. And there was one other thing I wanted to say about just a general observation. I went up to a house on El Granada Boulevard recently, and I'd never really been in someone's house, and I didn't realize that Quarry Park was within touching distance of the balconies. It was quite shocking, the fuel load up there. And I think I've been in close contact with Melinda talking about what community can do. It would be nice as a community if we could find ways to work together. And it doesn't look like replanting is a possibility because of county regulations and legal issues. But maybe those of us who really love the medians can go help clean them up. Maybe a community spirit. Maybe there's a way for us to help the people in the hills and the ridges to address the problems there. But I think that someone it could be the fire department, it could be someone else, but a shared community buy-in where we're helping each other would be such a lovely thing to see.
Thank you, Jane. Steve?
Yeah, 2 items. One being maybe for a data source for the fireworks. I would imagine the sheriff's office, because they respond to those calls, that they might have that in specific locations where you would see some clumping that might be helpful. And then one point, I don't know if the team is considering is our fluctuation in population for visitors. And some of these scenarios will play out. I don't know what factors that's going to play. And I don't know who would keep track of that information, Chamber of Commerce, Caltrans, but I don't know if that will play a role, but I would hope that it would, as we talk about the threat and possibilities of ignition. Again, we're not talking about evacuation, but from a broad overall view of everything that happens to us on the coast side is affected by the amount of visitors in any day. So I'm curious from the team if that's part of the consideration of final data?
You mean it has visitorship or trends in, you know, and how many people are coming to the coast? I don't think that's been something that has been considered, has it, Rita?
No, we haven't been considering that.
And Matt? Matt, are you there?
Yeah, I just wanted, I was going to bring this up in the last data collection, but this sounds like a good place to do it. In terms of the sort of long term, I know somebody mentioned the sort of the near term history, but in terms of the long term history of, you know, I think I heard a couple years ago Cal Fire, you know, being critiqued for their fire plan. So I would be interested in incorporating that sort of more long-term history as well. And sort of along with that, I think with, you know, projections of increasing temperatures, I think places where there's shade would be really kind of important to consider. And maybe along with that, and the last comment, I think in terms of trees sort of protecting against the particulates that are spewed out from car emissions, I think, you know, there's potentially some benefits that the community would maybe appreciate. So really taking that into consideration. And I was also going to second what somebody else had mentioned with regards to animal populations and habitat as a part of the data collection. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
So I wanna actually clarify. So Matt, the data that we're collecting is regarding risks to wildfire risks. The data aren't regarding how to minimize impact of potential projects that might be developed. That would happen later. So I just wanted to confirm that that when you're echoing Melinda's comment before about, you know, ecological sensitivity, I want to confirm that you're not talking about habitats as a risk, like dusky-footed wood rat nests being a fire source, a wildfire risk. It's more that you're saying you want to make sure that we're having ecological sensitivity with reducing risk to fire. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would basically be kind of buffer areas and yeah, so that
design considerations. Okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to, in all transparency, I want to manage expectations that we're not going to be doing that. So this project, the scope of this project is to identify, define, assess risks to the community based on wildfire. Those would be design considerations in individual projects to make sure that they're not detrimental in other ways. So just want to make sure that I'm really clear and transparent about that.
Okay, and so that's the project that if it is approved, then it would consider that, or it would consider that in the actual project?
So so this project will basically, what a result of this project will be like a menu, basically. Like, here are all the things that that we think will be most effective in reducing the risk of wildfire. Mm-hmm. Among that menu, there may be things that are desirable or not desirable. There might be things that have other consequences, you know, like environmental impacts, and so would need to be designed carefully or might not even be desirable for those reasons. So these is going to be a list that is focused on reducing the risk of wildfire. It's extremely focused. There are a number of other values that one might consider when managing your natural lands or spaces or your properties around your home. There's a lot of things to consider when you get really down to the point of designing a project. This isn't going to do that. This is going to kind of take the this is an incredible opportunity with resources to do a deep dive in a really small geographic area like I'm not seeing in other parts of the county or many other parts of the state, that is narrowly focused on reducing risk of fire. It is a beginning point, and then different entities or individuals might choose to implement some of these recommendations. And I think what you're particularly focusing on is vegetation management, removal of trees, for example. And there might be things to consider if you're removing trees, like erosion or habitat loss, nesting raptors, pollinators, soil health, revegetation, or other weeds coming in that have habitat problems or could also be a fire risk. These are all things that one would have to consider when developing a project that comes out of this scoping effort. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. In that case, I'll just say the long-term fire history of the area.
Thanks. And then when certainly the extent to which the RCD might be involved with any projects moving forward, I personally would really welcome your input and thoughts on ecological sensitivity, because that's a core value of our organization. Melinda, did you have additional observations?
Okay, so this was just going back to like reporting fireworks risks, where we could collect data on where those fireworks are coming from. And I was thinking of the fire department in El Granada. They may have some good data on that. And I'm sorry if somebody already mentioned that.
Thank you. You know, we actually do have time for any observations that come from Katie and Gopi, and then, okay, we can do Katie, Gopi, and Karen, and then we're going to switch into any Q&A that you might have for us before we wrap up. Katie.
Thanks, Kellex. Yeah, just sitting here listening to everyone talk about risk, one that came to mind that I don't think has been discussed are unoccupied homes and lots that are overgrown. I know there was a huge effort, you know, every spring the fire department goes around and, you know, assesses your property, and, you know, they assess the lots that, you know, some people have for sale or some people, you know, just have there. So I think when we're thinking of risk, we also need to add unoccupied homes and lots onto that too as a part of it, you know, because there's no one really paying attention to that as far as the owner. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, just regarding the fireworks, what I noticed is almost every night, especially during the COVID lockdowns, there were fireworks, and they seem to be at the bend of the road in, you know, at points along El Granada Boulevard and other adjoining things. And I'm sure many of them were just teenage hijinks. There were more significant blasts coming from the lower area of Quarry Park, I think from larger groups. So I think part of the issue is it's really tough to police that, and people are unaware of the risks. The only other thing I'll mention about tracking visiting crowds, I know that Panorama mentioned they haven't, that's not so much on their radar. The only reason I think it should be is that the only two primary evacuation conduits from El Granada spill out into Highway 1, and Highway 1 is directly impacted by visiting crowds on the weekends. So I would encourage them just to factor that into their model. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have actually covered quite a bit of ground tonight and gotten some really great new leads, recommendations, and resources. So I'm very grateful for those of you who showed up for this time to do that. And we did have some time for just general questions and answers if anybody wanted to ask them about the project itself. Now the hands start really going up fast. Walter.
Hi, so I lived in Oakland during the Oakland firestorm, 1991. I wasn't affected, but I remember at that time there were high winds. The fire spread so quickly, people barely had time to evacuate. So I live up in, you know, the top of El Granada Boulevard, and you know, those of us that live in that area, we're concerned about the time it would take to evacuate. So do you know if the assessment will will give us an idea of how quickly the fire may block the evacuation route. Because if that's the case, we have to then go the other way, which is go up the hill instead of going down the hill as a possible evacuation route. So that's one question. And then the other question I had is, can we get access to the data? Because that looks really interesting. That's all.
Why don't I just take a stab at the second part, and then I'll ask Rita to answer the first part. Regarding access to the data, all of the products that are developed as part of this project will be publicly accessible. We'll make them available, but not necessarily while we're working on them. And we don't have a lot of capacity. We have almost no capacity for back and forth on them, but everything that we develop is going to be publicly available. And not only will it be on the RCD's website, I'm assuming that the Mid-Coast Community Council will probably also want to host it on their website, and maybe others. Regarding the first question, Rita, did you want to answer that?
Sure. So I think the question is, at least as I recorded it, so I first want to clarify that I've recorded it correctly. It sounds like you want to know how much time you would have to evacuate. Is that the question?
Yeah, the question is, wanted to know if the assessment will quantify how fast the fire would spread, and that will give us an idea whether we want to evacuate going downhill or actually evacuate going uphill.
That might be a question for Vibrant Planet, and I want to say it's not going, I think it's there are lots of variables when it comes to talking about how quickly a fire can spread. So I think the way that we might approach that would be, if we can't give you that data, it's something that we can consider as an offshoot, something that would be a recommendation to look into further. But let me pass it over to Mike for a quick response.
Yeah, rate of spread is definitely a metric that we use to drive risk, especially to the community. However, there's so many variables involved with where a fire starts, what the actual weather is doing, what vegetation, what suppression resources are active. That's going to drive that particular decision for you. And I don't think that's necessarily something that we tend to, I don't want to say advertise, but I'll say advertise, is the actual rate of spread. It's buried in the numbers. The data is available, but it's not something that we really hang our hat on. We just really focus on identifying that risk and things we can do, or opportunities that present themselves to mitigate some of that risk.
REA?
I have a question. I want to respond to that last question, which is very good. Go uphill or downhill? One data point is what Chief David Cosgrave says is, when in doubt, go downhill. The fire rises, go downhill. So that's his advice. My question is, you guys seem like you're doing a terrific job of gathering data. I want to ask very naively, why should I care? What impact has this had on decisions in your experience? How does your effort affect the decisions that get made?
I don't know if it'll affect the decisions that get made. I think what this can do is a couple of things. One is that some of the recommendations that are made would be better positioned to be competitive for grant funding. So there's a lot of funding in the current and probably in future budgets from the state for grant programs to build wildfire resiliency. And those funding entities are an application would be much more competitive if the recommended action was rooted in something scientific or analytical, so that they know it's a strategic investment because it's actually likely to reduce risk, and has gone through a process like this that includes various partners and that sort of thing, is collaborative the way that this has been. So I think for me, that's a driver for this. For another reason that this is me again, is that for the RCD, where are we likely to allocate our resources to provide support to the community is we want to work in ways where we would be effective. And so this process helps us make decisions about where we can be effective in our own investments. Otherwise, I don't know why you would care. I think that's an individual choice.
Thank you.
Jane?
I have two quick comments and a question. The first comment is about your question about fireworks, and I just wanted to add that if we can ask the Parks Committee when Burnham Strip is opened as a park to see if they have any plans to minimize any risks there for fires. My second comment is about the tsunami alarm. You know, they redid the tsunami maps to make us less vulnerable. There's not as much risk as they originally thought. But in two of the fires, the first fire I remember, I don't remember the town, they all evacuated at the same time and they had a traffic jam. So when they got to Paradise, they decided they would evacuate in groups. And that was also a problem. So I'm wondering two things. One is, can we use the tsunami alarm for fires? Because if it's going to be seldom used, it would be universal that everyone could hear it. And then two, would it be possible to do a practice evacuation so we know whether everyone leaving at the same time is better than people leaving in groups, or, you know, what is the best strategy? How is the parking? How does the flow of it go? And I don't know if that's outside of the scope, but I thought I'd mention it because I think the tsunami alarm might be another resource asset. And then my third is actually a question, and it has to do with whether or not your project has much of an outreach aspect to it, because I think for many of us, we were caught a little off guard because some groups who found Common Cause were more organized, they had petitions, they met with you, they gave feedback, and others of us just kind of limp along solo. And then I know people who were on the medians that had trees removed, some of them feel very disempowered and very discouraged because it happened to them without any real involvement. And so I'm hoping that you have an outreach program that can really, and that's the question, that can really keep the community, not only those who are very politically astute, but people who have a stake in what's going on, but don't know how to provide input in a sophisticated way to you.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see, there are a number of things in there. Let me address the last one first. Unfortunately, the short answer to your question is no, we don't have a big outreach effort planned around this. So the Resource Conservation District is not part of San Mateo County or county government. We are the work that we're doing right now is this project, the scoping project. So the outreach is right now. That's what this is. And our outreach is focused on getting your input and your expertise so that we can have the best possible product making recommendations. And also in terms of outreach, all the input that we've gotten from the partners who are experts, Coastside Fire Protection District, CAL FIRE, et cetera. So the issue with the medians was something that we weren't involved with at all. The RCD, we work where we're invited on someone's property. So that's kind of an issue that's outside of our scope. I don't know if regarding the other comments or questions that you made regarding like the tsunami alarm and a drill for evacuation, that's also, I think, outside the scope of this. I wonder if there's anybody else here who could suggest how that recommendation might advance. Would that be bring it up at the Mid-Coast Community Council meeting, or Steve, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or I think I saw Chief Cox on the line. If anybody else has a recommendation for how to advance that, it's outside of our scope. No. Then since nobody's responding, my recommendation would be to bring it up at the Mid-Coast Community Council meeting. And oh, Steve just took off mute. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I would just say that one is Office of Emergency Management, probably deals with that. Would be one resource. As far as your comment about how an individual gets information, that's something we all struggle with. And we've talked about it internally in this process about how agencies don't even recognize how other agencies operate. And there's no really easy way around that except to try to slowly immerse yourself, listen to board meetings. I would say Coastside Fire, we have a website, we have our board meetings each month. That's a place where individuals can have a voice, can ask the questions, be educated, or at least be directed and linked up with resources. So just a little bit of outreach will take you a long way. County, all my experiences is government responds really well. In most cases, if you have specific questions and are seeking ways to be better informed. That's just my positive response to your questions.
Thank you so much thanks for jumping in there. So, so we have a few more minutes here to be able to answer questions about this project before we wrap up and talk about sort of next steps and where to get information. And I definitely understand that there's a real need and desire to talk about fire generally and concerns and safety. And for this time that's left, I'm going to be focusing on the scope of this project, which is to identify and define and assess risks and develop a recommended suite of actions to address those risks. So Gopi, I think you're next.
Yeah, so it's clear that, there's a very clear scope and the team is really, very professional in trying to get to that execution. But my understanding is that out of this, there are going to be recommendations made to private and public entities with no guarantee that any of them actually will follow through or do anything about it. So how will we materially be safer in our persons and our properties a year from now? What sort of value is this providing, given, I'm sure some investment is happening? I would contrast that to the median clearing that was done, which actually made some clear safety improvement, at least to a small group of people. So I don't see where this is going to be actually producing results in any fundamental way. It's all maybe if somebody does something kind of stuff. I know I just want to kind of get that conversation out there saying, what can we expect other than a recommendation? Most recently, I was on Coastside Recovery Initiative, and our fundamental thing as the community to participate was to make sure it wasn't going to be shelfware, that some commitment would follow through and we would do something. So that's my question.
Yeah, it's a good and reasonable question, I think. There is no certainty. I think that's the case generally with planning efforts or certainly in the planning efforts with which we engage. We identify where there are opportunities, and then we design solutions, and then we seek the resources and the permitting to implement those solutions. And at any point along the way, if we didn't choose to proceed, we wouldn't get to those solutions. So you're right, there's nothing obligating anyone to do anything here. I think that this is more a document that will help people make sure that the recommendations, what people do pursue, is grounded in something that's analytical, rather than just purely, what assumptions are or advocacy based, or at least that the advocacy is grounded in something analytical, and that that you have something substantive evidence to be able to get resources to implement some of those recommendations. But you're right. There's no commitment to implement any of these things. It's just sort of a critical path, essential first step. You have to take the step to get to the outcome, but it doesn't assure you of the outcome. So I'm really hoping that people feel as committed as I do to seeing this through. Mary?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Yes, Maureen.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Well, since the focus of this section is to make sure that we provide comments to the consultants, I hope the consultants will at least consider my comments and maybe incorporate it into their report. So let me just start here. I think it was Gopi maybe a year or 2 years ago when we started to discuss fire. And I think he recommended heat sensors in the woods, that they would pick up early detection if there were a small fire. I think that's an excellent idea. I also want to comment that the fire break that did go in behind the El Granada Boulevard homes, I don't understand why certain trees were left in on the house side of the break. They should all come out. They're eucalyptus. And right now I look at a bunch of them that could take my house out overnight or within one hit. And I am commenting, I think any fire clearing that I do see, it's good. But sometimes when I see them clearing and like raking the low ground, and I think just about any of my neighbors would agree on this meeting here tonight, that what concerns us are 200 feet tall eucalyptus, the canopy, that if they were to hit the houses, that is what would really damage the properties. So I hope the consultants focus not so much on raking and clearing lower brush, but look at these tall trees that could do devastating damage. And I have to reemphasize, erosion behind my home is a huge issue. So when you're dealing with trying to tame nature, every house has to be looked at individually rather than just clear cutting, because you could get into serious problems with erosion. And then finally, I also have to kind of utter the concerns or repeat the concerns that Gopi just said. It's the whole idea of like the consultants versus actual action. So I so many times I get involved or listen to something that's an active issue in the community, and they automatically go to consultants. And then I just think, why don't we just take those $1,000 and start clearing out some more trees? Thank you for listening. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Graham, did you have any questions?
I didn't have a comment to ask here, a question.
Oh, Graham, he's the next person after you.
Okay. Yeah, I have a comment. I can't remember whether it was Mike or Colton who was saying that they're looking at the 97th percentile of weather. And that seems a little strange to me, because it seems like they should be looking at, or I would have expected them to be looking at what is called the fire weather, or the red flag weather. So by making it 97th percentile, it seems like that kind of waters down the statistics that you're looking at, by looking at, you know, the actual red flag weather that we have is much smaller than 3% a year, I think, but it's when the very high risks happen.
Yep, no, that's a great point. You know, we have in certain cases looked at 98th or 99th percentile weather conditions, but what that shows is that there's not much you can do in a 99%, 99.9% weather event. So what we try to do is get the worst case scenario that's realistic. So 97th percentile is kind of the industry standard in what we normally use. Colton, can you chime in on why that is, or what trade-offs that might present in any kind of modeling effort that we're doing, as far as, you know, going to the 99th percentile weather versus sticking with that 97%?
Well, or just looking at the fire weather.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, I mean, just saying 97th percentile weather may be a little bit misleading. It's using energy release component, which is linked with high fire behavior days, and then taking fuel moistures and wind conditions that occur under the 97th percentile of those conditions. So really, these are the conditions that are your fire weather likely to drive large wildfires. You don't want to get too extreme on modeling very, very specific weather conditions that aren't likely to occur. So you do want to have some reasonable number of observations that that do occur throughout the year. Yeah, I think. Let's see, moving us along. Okay, I'll just wrap it up there. I think feel free to follow up if you have specific comments or want to know at some point how we ended up doing that.
Follow up with Sheena. She put her contact information in the chat.
Yeah, it'll be
we'll
a little
some more information afterwards.
At least a couple weeks until we know have actually pulled weather data and started to map the stations. So just a timeline on that.
Thanks for that question, Graham.
Matt? Thank you. Well, I just really appreciate what you're all doing and what everybody making comments. Just a few really quick questions. I'm curious where we can look to get more information on the sort of model that's being used. I'm also curious about whether there's community opportunities for community participation with regards to the suite of actions taking place. And then, I know that this group only works where they're invited, and residents are giving direction, and environmental consultants are here, and it looks very well taken care of. I suppose I am a little concerned that an algorithm might say something that a lot of the people who live here will have to deal with, and doesn't take into consideration the unmappable complexities. So I know somebody looks at a 200-foot tree as a threat to their life and to their home, and etc. But on the other hand, that's also why people live here, and that's all. So I just wanted to bring that up. And the RCD, I know the sort of motto is helping the land. So I if you could reiterate how this project is, I can see very clearly how it's going to help residents. I'm a little less clear on how it's going to help the land. So with regards to the model, with regards to the suite of actions and community participation in that, and in terms of helping the land, those are my questions and concerns. And if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear. Thank you.
So I'm going to be a little bit brief because I want to make sure that we wrap up in time and hear other folks who have their hands up. Regarding more information about the model, there's two places I would recommend getting that. The scope of work and the description, a brief description of the model that's being used is on the RCD's website and also on the Mid-Coast Community Council website. And then you can just do a Google search to learn more about that model if you'd like. The next thing that you asked, if I remember correctly, was, wait, what was the next thing? It was, there was something.
Actions, and if there were possibilities for community participation in that suite.
Thank you. So is there a possibility for community participation? I think that kind of depends on what the recommendations are. So if there's a recommendation that is one that would lend itself to community participation, it's certainly my hope that the community would take ownership of that, and that somebody in the community would take leadership for that. We're not planning a lot of community engagement around the model and the model outputs or anything like that. This is it. We're getting input from the community, from data observations, priorities, concerns, like what we got tonight. And then the other piece about, there's more complexities than go into the algorithm. The algorithm is about reducing wildfire risk. There are other considerations when implementing a project, such as aesthetics, and other values that you might have, aesthetics, ecosystem function, etc. We spend on our staff, we spend a lot of time talking about, thinking about, and really delving into the complex trade-offs of natural resource management, like when a eucalyptus tree sequesters a lot of carbon, but catastrophic wildfire releases a lot more. When eucalyptus trees offer some habitat features that are really valuable, and they displace other habitat features that are also incredibly valuable. There are complex trade-offs in natural resource management. And so if it ever gets to the point of implementing the projects, we'll have to think those through.
Thank you.
Thanks. Keith.
Thank you. I am kind of responding to what Walter brought up earlier. I've spent quite a bit of time comparing what our weather, our topography, our fuel loads, all that are, compared to what happened in the Oakland fire, and specifically the FEMA report on the Oakland 1991 fire. And the results are scary, how similar all of these things are. And the other part that's really scary is the fact that they had 15 to 30 minutes to evacuate. And if that happened in Quarry Park with, 6,000 people next door, I can't imagine what that evacuation would look like. That's it.
Thank you, Keith. Melinda?
Yes, sorry. I've been working with volunteers to try and restore the medians that were cut, as you know. And my question is to the consultants, because if they or the group or team decides to cut the medians, my question is, can they help us come up with a plan for ecological restoration and fire resiliency on those medians? Because it is out of the scope of RCD to help us. Is that correct?
Well, it's outside of the consultant scope for this project. That's not what their work is for this project. If you want to hire consultants are you asking if you can hire them to do that work, or are you asking if they could do that as part of this project?
Is it out of the scope of the project for them to recommend to cut the medians?
It's not necessarily out of the scope for them to make that recommendation. I don't know if the model will say that the medians are a priority. We'll see if the model in their work says that a significant way to reduce the threat of wildfire is to remove trees from the medians. They might make that recommendation. And then presumably, I think for any vegetation management project, there's going to have to be some consideration of ecological implications of that.
Okay, whereas...
But they're not going to be developing in this project. The consultants are not going to be addressing impacts from any previous projects. They're not going to be developing mitigation, ecological mitigation for previous fuel load reduction work.
Okay, what about if the work that they recommend is what I'm saying? Like if they recommend to have more trees cut or have it completely cut, there needs to be some kind of plan, right? Otherwise, we're just left with nothing, no ecological fire resiliency.
So what they will do is they're going to make they're going to offer a conceptual list of projects, but that would, certainly indicate that there's ecological considerations or certain avoidance measures that would be needed, but the specific measures to avoid environmental impact or to restore ecology would happen in the process of designing a project. And that's not, we're not going to get project designs out of this.
Oh, so this is, okay. And where would we get to the project design so that the community?
That would be a next phase. So this is a first phase that identifies what are the types of actions that would most reduce the threat of fire. And then we can take some of those recommended actions and develop them as projects that would involve design, permitting, funding and implementation.
Is that another meeting that will be open to the community, the project design?
There are so many different types of projects. So if the project design, if one of the recommendations was how you manage your property, there probably won't be a public meeting, but if it was something that was maybe a large recommendation for something to happen on county parks and county parks decided to have a meeting, they might, that really depends on the recommendations. If it's a policy recommendation having to do with, making permanent the exemption to the tree ordinance, then the county would presumably go through a public process if it was policy related. That really depends on what the recommendations are.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. And last but not least, I don't know what your name is.
Silvana. Yes, hi, my name is Silvana. So first of all, thank you for this. Really appreciate you taking our input. I wanted to add on a comment that was made about the traffic. I think we should take traffic and the tourist influx into consideration when we're evaluating the risks and ultimately the recommendations that would come up of the project. Many of the residents on the coast, we've been trapped on a number of occasions on a stretch of Highway 192 for hours because there's tree trimming happening down the road or there's an accident. So it can feel like a death trap in the event of a fire. I feel like this would really make a big difference. And my question, this was my comment. My question is, as part of the project, what's going to come out of this project? If the project recommends removal of trees or changing in any way of green areas, would that recommendation also include a long-term maintenance for those changes so they continue to make sense over time?
I think it depends on what the recommendation is. If the best way to reduce the risk of wildfire is a project that would require maintenance, that would be part of what they would need to scope out. Like eucalyptus, right? Eucalyptus springs back, it requires retreatment. And that's a cost and a consideration.
Right. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all so much for showing up tonight and for the so many of you who stuck it out to the end. I want to share this screen about where to get information. This is Sheena's email address. She's the project manager. If you have questions, directly ask her. Sheena is also regularly attending Mid-Coast Community Council meetings and providing updates. This is the project webpage at the RCD where you can go to get information or documents. We also are a public agency. We have monthly meetings of our board of directors. You can come make comments at any point or ask questions at any point. And you are our constituents, and we are, we want to hear what you think. There's information also. We will be posting this video on our YouTube page. I'm not sure if we'll be able to post it on our website. Yeah, we can. We can post a link to it on our website. We just won't embed it there. Feel free to share that with anyone who wasn't able to participate tonight, but you think might be interested in learning what you did tonight. And thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and thank you all very much for attending.